People have sexual preferences like they have preferences in all aspects of life. I mean, we all have our own preferences regards where we want to go on holidays, what sort of books we like, whether we like them or not, what sort of programs we like. In all areas of life, people have their own personal preferences, and the same applies to sex. I mean, when you see sex portrayed on television, it always seems to have the same routine. People going through exactly the same motions, doing exactly the same things more or less every time. And obviously that only portrays one small aspect of people's sexual lives. But in reality, people have all sorts of personal preferences, whether it's in terms of who they desire, what sex they desire, what type of look they desire, what size breasts, what size buttocks, what size body, all sorts of things. And the same applies to actual sexual activity when people are engaged in sexual activity together. Now that's all fairly obvious probably to most people, but yet I meet many people in my practice who worry about their particular sexual preferences, because a lot of people have what they consider bizarre or unusual sexual preferences, and they're concerned that they will never meet anybody who would tolerate these practices, and they're going to be doomed to a life of sexual loneliness. And often they'll get engaged in sexual activity with people or form sexual relationships, but they will never mention this sexual preference and never bring it up and never indulge in it. Now that's all very well if it's not a major preference and it's not very important, but for some people, particularly with preferences that they think are unusual or bizarre, these preferences are very, very important to their sexual fulfillment, let's call it. So I think the advent of the internet has been great for people like that, because more and more people recognize that things that they like to do sexually is something that millions of people around the world like to do sexually, and they're not so unusual, and it's not so bizarre, and it's not something to feel guilty about. So whatever the preference is, if it's important to people for sexual fulfillment, I think it's important that they're brave enough. Well, first of all, that they know there's no possible way they have a preference that millions of other people don't have, and that they should be brave enough, if it's important to them, to bring it up with a partner and to mention that it's important. An example of what I'm speaking about would be anal sex. Anal sex, the anus is a very erotic area. I mean, we think generally of genitals as being an erotic area, but the anus for a lot of people is an extremely erotic zone. In other words, when their anus is touched, or the anal area is touched, or there's anal penetration, it is extremely sexually pleasurable for them. And the same applies to things like what we call bondage. In other words, some people like to be tied up when they have sex. Some people like to be beaten during sex. I don't mean beaten in a way that causes damage, but beaten to a degree that causes sexual pleasure primarily. Some people like to be spanked during sex. Some people like to use different types of materials during sex. For example, leather is a very common one. So, but all these activities can cause problems for people because they think it makes them abnormal, because they're not engaged in straightforward sex. Now, where it can cause a problem, I suppose, is if your preferences are unusual or relatively unusual, it may make it harder for you to find a partner who is comfortable with these activities, or maybe even likes them themselves. But that's the only drawback. But I think it is important, if these things are important to you, and they're an important aspect of sex to you, and they need to be indulged in, that you do take the time to find a partner. And you'll be surprised how many people are quite happy to engage in similar activities. And I mean, in my practice, generally it's men who tend to want the more unusual practice in sex more than women. Not exclusively, but more than women. And a lot of them imagine no woman would tolerate this. Now, in practice, if I encourage them, for example, you must talk to a woman about this and see if it's a possibility. When they do talk to a woman, it's amazing how many women are quite happy to engage, quite happy to get involved. No problem whatsoever for them. And men are often surprised at that aspect of it. Now, it can happen that you might meet a partner who has no interest in this sort of activity and has an absolute aversion to it. And then you have to assess whether this is a relationship for you or not.